It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. In just a few words, Charles Dickens penned one of the most powerful and gripping opening lines in the history of literature. It is also, frankly, a questionable line. If you read the rest of the story, you'll notice that A Tale of Two Cities does a glorious job capturing the grit and despair that makes the time that Dickens describes the worst of times. It's much harder to identify what made it the best. I've been thinking a lot about that line since Wednesday, when a mob desecrated the sacred halls of our democracy. I've been thinking a lot about that line since Wednesday, when the Confederate flag was carried through the people's house, sullying the pride of generations who stood tall, knowing that the flag of bigotry never entered its hallowed halls, not even during the Civil War. I've been thinking a lot about that line since Wednesday, when the world looked on in horror as elected officials lay on the floor of the chamber that had been a beacon for us and for nations around the world of the peaceful rule of law. It's easy to see the worst of times. A vile noose of racism lifted in our nation's capital, white supremacy raging, including overt anti-Semitism, which should make every single one of us shudder. Camp Auschwitz, emblazoned on the sweatshirt of one photographed man in the thick of the mob, the man next to him smiling. And that's not to mention the hospitals filling to critical capacity in states across our nation, illness and death growing exponentially even as we await the promise of a vaccine, and an increasingly unbridgeable rift in civic connection. It's easy to see the worst of times. It's hard to see the best. And so I've been wondering, how did Dickens come to imagine that a world filled with so much pain could also hold beauty? Was the best of times he referred to in the opening line simply a swipe at those in their London bubble who dispassionately watched desperate revolution unfolding from Paris from a safe and comfortable distance? Or was it a profound perspective on the world of the revolution itself, that even there could be a best to go along with the worst, a season of light with the season of darkness, a spring of hope with the winter of despair? Are these just words? Or does Dickens, a Victorian Kohelet, have helpful wisdom for our time today? In A Tale of Two Cities, the personal is a prism of the political. Where does Dickens find the best of times? Not just in the faraway bubble, but in the love shared by those battered by the brutal wave of history. It's tempting for us to make a similar move now, to say that big historical turmoil may be afoot in Washington, but here we are safe and loved. Here, in the middle of a pandemic, if we are healthy, we are counting our blessings. Here, in the middle of unimaginable upheaval, if we can close our doors securely, we are surviving the storm. And that's all true and all important, but it's not all. Dickens wrote what he knew. He channeled his own gritty childhood into his words, creating characters that had and inspired an inclination to empathy in those who might otherwise turn a blind eye to the plight of the poor, to the situation of others. But he didn't just use his writing to open souls. He used his book readings to open pocketbooks to philanthropy, famously going on a book tour to secure funding for a hospital that otherwise would have collapsed, because for him, the political was personal, and what he believed demanded action. And so, Dickens takes us deeper. In his Tale of Two Cities, tragedy is transformed to triumph in the final words of Sidney Carton, who imagines a world beyond the trauma of the now, a world where the sufferings of today will become the substratum for a new tomorrow, a world that we are always on the road to building. As Carton's final imagined monologue beautifully captures, he says, "I see long ranks of new oppressors who have risen on the destruction of the old perishing. I see a beautiful city and a brilliant people rising from the abyss." In other words, the despair of the present can be born with a vision of a future that we can help even now to build. Dickens' 1-2 move of first the personal and then the political is a move that Moses makes in our Parsha today. In Midian, tending sheep, Moses found love. He found family. He found freedom. And then history knocks on his door. There's a world out there that needs you, God says. Time to start walking towards its repair. Time to speak truth to power. Time to fight for the right of a world that can be better than it is. Time to own that it is profoundly broken and needs your hands to mend. And obviously, since otherwise there wouldn't be a story, Moses goes. And less obviously, Moses doesn't go alone. He meets his brother along the way, and his sister, and the Israelites, and it is when they join together that change starts to happen. So too for us today. It's easy to see all the ways that this is the worst of times. And yet this week, our democratic system of government was sorely tested and held fast. A majority of Senate Republicans joined with Senate Democrats to uphold our system's core. It's easy to see the worst of times. But this week in Georgia, the epicenter of the famed Southern strategy, a Black pastor and a Jew were elected. It's easy to see the worst of times, but into this moment, God sent you. And lest you are dispirited, consider the words that rang from the Ebenezer Baptist Church in 1965, preached by the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King said, "Ever since the founding fathers of our nation dreamed this dream in all its magnificence, America has been something of a schizophrenic personality, tragically divided against herself. On the one hand, we have proudly professed the great principles of democracy, but on the other hand, we have sadly practiced the very opposite of those principles. But now, more than ever," he continued, "America is challenged to realize its dream, for the shape of the world today does not permit our nation the luxury of an anemic democracy. So yes, the dream has been shattered, and I have had my nightmarish experience," he said. "But I tell you this morning once more that I haven't lost the faith. I still have a dream." Today, his successor at that same Ebenezer Baptist Church is heading to the Senate. Raphael Warnock, reflecting on the meaning of this new fact shared about his mother, the 82-year-old hands that used to pick somebody else's cotton went to the polls and picked her youngest son to be a United States senator. The improbable journey that led me to this place in this historic moment in America could only happen here. Wednesday was one of the lowest moments in American history. It also perhaps can be the start of our best if we use the shock of this week to charge us towards action, reminding us that the American story is a dream whose best of times, even now, especially now, still lie in our reach. Shabbat Shalom.